we have, I think, rather lost touch with the seriousness, even with the pent-up anger of such a view. This is, I think, because we're more used to the Augustinian tradition on the nature of the fall of Adam and Eve, to which the issue of labor was basically peripheral. For Augustine and his successors in the Latin West, the fall of Adam and Eve was a very personal thing. The fall had brought about a profound inner weakening of their individual wills. This weakening of the will was shown in its most subtle, enduring, and let's face it, its most interesting form in unregulated sexual desire. But this was not so in the Christian East. Rather, in this world, the true fall, the fall which blotted out all others in the imagination of many Syrians, had been a fall from work-free abundance of Eden into the present world of toil. A vivid Syriac text of the early 5th century that has now been translated and edited by Robert Kitchen and Martine Parmentier, the Liber Gradum, the Book of Degrees, enables us to relive, as it were, from the inside, the dire fall into labor of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, this book writes, had not known drudgery in Eden. Wrapped in contemplation, their labor had consisted only in the labor of the angels, the Polchana, the Malache. They had been felachin, all right, but they had been workers of the Spirit. Their backs had not been broken, their hands had not been hardened by earthly toil. Their toil instead had been the weightless, ethereal toil of prayer, as they joined their voices with the angels in ceaseless praise of God, their bodies swaying gently, but without violent effort, when they bowed before him. Now, through Adam and Eve's act of disobedience, the human race had fallen into many evils. It was overshadowed by death. It was exposed to the fierce ache of sexual desire, but worst of all by far, because most shamefully inconsistent with Adam's first weight-free labor as high priest of all creation, it had fallen into work. It was caught in the permafrost of toil of Ramla. Yet Christ had brought back in himself the unbearable lightness of Adam. He'd extended it to his true followers. A few elect souls might free themselves from the world of labor to wander freely along the roads of the Middle East, to establish themselves within sight of teeming industrious villages and towns. In this respect, we must remember the extent to which in Syriac piety Christ had been an avatar of Adam. And so the holy man who followed Christ was an Adam in his own times. The holy man was a sign to his times, a human wake-up call brought forward by God to challenge, to comfort a world caught in the coils of labor. This was what it meant to live the life of the Demuta de Malachi, a life in the likeness of the angels. For the Syrians, we must remember, an angel was not a distant cosmic being. Rather, for them an angel was what an angel does. And the one thing that an angel does not do is work. Jews and Christians were agreed on this point. In the words of the rabbi, Abahu Rabbi Abahu, discussing the heavenly powers, angels are nourished by the rays of the divine presence, while with humans, if they do not labor, they may not eat. Instead, the holy men of Syria brought to their own care-worn world a touch of the worship of the toilless angels. Instilled on top of his pillar, Simeon Stylites would sway backwards and forwards with bowing motions. He did this because, as he said, he saw an angel at his side, prostrating himself in this manner before the throne of God. Indeed, Simeon once did this 1,244 times. Now, the thrill of this story is that we know of it because members of the bishop's retinue were standing beneath the pillar and counting every bow. They gave up, and Simeon, a sort of angelic energizer bunny, just kept on bowing. Now, to look at Simeon, therefore, acting out the life of the angels in this fully concrete manner, was to look past mere nostalgia for the loss of a golden age. The author of the Book of Degrees certainly has no illusions about the society in which he lived. Present-day society for him was not bathed in the benign providence of God. Its sharp structures and stratifications had been created from the top down by the clash of evil human wills. If people do not wish it, they would not have become governors and doers of evil. But because they love money, transient glory, they offer bribes, they become rulers, they take up the power of the sword to kill whom they desire. Social hierarchies were no divine blessing, nor even was war divinely blessed. In a remarkable passage, the author of the Book of Degrees stated that since the coming of Christ, no war can be said to have been raised up by God. All wars were the result simply of human willfulness, untouched by the providence of God. At best, government was useful for this world, but it was not a pretty sight. Holy persons, as imitators of the angels, looked through it with disabused, sad eyes. It's worth noting that the hagiography of the Syriac world shows a remarkable degree of involvement with social grievances on the part of these seemingly ethereal figures. Simeon Stylites regulated rates of interest for entire villages. Alexander the Sleepless, later the holy man Habib of Amida, modern Diyarbakir in modern eastern Turkey, ranged the banks of the Euphrates, challenging landowners to burn their collections of debtors' bonds. Persons such as the author of the Book of Degrees had no doubt that they were looking out on a fallen world, living in the shadow of Adam's first tragic longing for the earth. In the words of Ephraim the Syrian in the late 4th century, only the sweat of Christ that fell from the cross could redeem an earth soaked for millennium in the sweat of Adam's brow. In this lecture, I've tried to do justice to the cosmic and social background of a distinctive Syrian piety. Behind the colorful actions of the holy men and women of late antique Syria lay serious issues concerning human society and its relation both to labor and to the natural world. Thus, to sum up, throughout Syria and other eastern provinces, Egypt included, the spread of Manichaeism was not an isolated phenomenon, nor was it a peripheral phenomenon. It coincided at the same time with a wave of similar Christian ascetics who considered, like the Manichaean elect, that they were fully entitled to the support of the faithful because they, being freed from labor, were engaged in the weightless labor of prayer on behalf of all persons. No matter how deeply they might differ in their beliefs, the structures of the two groups crystallized were startlingly homologous. A core of perfect religious virtuosos lived in a symbiotic relationship with lay disciples in whose economic activities they shared in no way, and on whose generosity they depended in every way, even as regular providers of food for their physical survival. The Syrian wanderers were less radical than were the Manichaeans. They did indeed expect the average righteous Christian in the villages to continue to support the local poor through regular almsgiving. Indeed, Syriac lives of the saints are remarkable for their compassion and for their thoroughly demystified views of the inequities of their own society. But the holy men of Syria had no doubt whatsoever that they themselves were members of the holy poor. They already lived an angelic life, and this was precisely because through their freedom from physical toil, their lives echoed palpably on earth, the toilless life of the angels in heaven. They'd stepped out from under the dark shadow of toil which had come to rest over the human race since Adam's fall. It's against the background of these preoccupations that we should, in our next lecture, place the answer presented by the monks of Egypt to the Christian piety that had become so prominent in Syria and which threatened also to make its way far up the valley of the Nile. In the mid-4th century, the Christian regions of the East as a whole, Egypt and Syria alike, found themselves poised between two great and evenly balanced alternatives, representing two conflicting wings of the ascetic movement. One wing, as we've seen, claimed to have risen above labor, to be entitled to support through the alms of the laity. The other wing, the wing of which we know much more, because it came to be more fully represented in the monastic traditions of Western Europe, projected instead an image of ferocious self-sufficiency in which sedentary monks were expected to feed themselves by the work of their own hands. It was to Egypt, not to Syria, that Benedict of Nursia looked back, and eventually with Benedict the entire medieval West. Not until the Franciscan movement of the 13th century did Western Christianity have to grapple with the explosive mixture of ascetic piety and a mendicant lifestyle that had once been normal in the Christian Middle East of late antiquity. And so it is to Egypt, as the great alternative to the religious ebullience of the Fertile Crescent, that we will turn tomorrow on our third and last lecture. Thanks a lot.